integrations were built into it because you joined us last fall or years prior. Indeed,
let's just get to the part with Rob.
Where we last left.
All right. So you can now take CS164 at 50% faster. So we'll maybe see you next week. The reality is, though, now I just have an incentive to talk even faster, so this feature is completely useless if you try to use it online. Without further ado, and you can also slow certain folks, myself included, down. So today is ultimately about design patterns. So we're not going to look at CodeIgniter per se, and we'll find, in fact, retroactively, that CodeIgniter does offer one or more of these things called design patterns, which are not really sort of new technologies or fundamental sort of models that you must adhere to, but rather they're ways of approaching common problems. The reality is if you've been programming for some time, whether it's months or years, you probably find yourself, when you sit down to do a new project, stealing code, or at least stealing ideas from some previous project, and realizing that, wow, I've made something that's quite like this before. The aesthetics might be completely different. The data set might be completely different. But honestly, odds are if you did a web-based final project in CS50, there's a non-trivial number of you who essentially took pset7, CS50 Finance's code, copied the whole directory, and then just started ripping out what you didn't want and putting in what you did want so that you at least had a starting point. But even there, as we've seen, it's not, pset7 was not the best structured design because there was so much view, there was so much controller sort of commingled in there. And it would be very hard to, for instance, all of a sudden make CS50 Finance support, say, a mobile phone without redoing absolutely everything. So among the ideas we'll look at today through some concrete examples are how, when you have some coding problem to solve, how can you sort of approach your code in such a way that it just makes it easier to maintain and you can actually ultimately write even less code. So here are just a few popular ones. And if you look back at the course's syllabus, there's a recommended book called Design Patterns by the so-called Gang of Four, a very famous book from a few years back that introduced and really popularized a lot of these design patterns. So even though we'll use PHP today, the reality is that most of these ideas transcend the specific language. And we'll see some of these same ideas in Objective-C. You could apply them to JavaScript. You can apply them to C, C++, depending on the model in question. But you'll find that a number of these are actually object-oriented in nature, which is a topic we'll look at in some detail today, but then also next week when we begin to look at iOS and Objective-C. So MVC is actually a design pattern, right? We already crossed one of these off the list. And even though you might be struggling with the actual incarnation of it in CodeIgniter, if you think back or look back at some of the homegrown examples we did a week and two ago, where I had the MVC1 directory, MVC2, MVC3, we did like 9 examples of MVC, but homegrown, completely manufactured myself. And I had the header function and the footer function, or the more generalized render function. And so when we say design patterns, we mean modeling your code in this sort of generic way so that you can solve a new problem, but in the same way you solved some previous problem. So MVC is a perfect example of that. That just makes it easier, arguably, to solve common types of problems. And by problem here, I mean a mobile website, right, that's got multiple pages and that pulls data from a database. So singleton pattern. This is actually a very popular one, and we'll look at in some detail today. And we've actually been using it. What does it mean if you're using this so-called singleton pattern? Anyone know? Yeah.
It's a class you only have one instance of?
Yeah, so it's a class that you just have one instance of. So again, we'll talk more about object-oriented programming if you haven't quite wrapped your mind around it. But in object-oriented programming, you generally have these things called classes, though that's not necessarily the case. JavaScript, for instance, is what's called a prototype-based language. But a class is kind of like a template, not to be confused with MVC. It's like the blueprints for some data structure that's going to have 0 or more pieces of data inside of it and 0 or more methods, aka functions, inside of it. And so with that definition of a class, what then is an object before we come back to singleton? Yeah. Perfect. It's an instance of the class. So if you think of a class, again, as sort of a template or a blueprint or a mold, if you will, the object is the thing that comes out of the mold. And you can make as many of these objects as you want by just refilling the mold and taking the output out. So a class is, again, sort of the mold out of which you can make objects. And it's actually quite useful to have multiple instances of the same class. If you've got a class, like we talked about for a student, and you have 100 or so students, it's probably nice to have different objects representing each of those students. Alternatively, you could have a students object inside of which is maybe an array, but but that's getting a little messy, right? The idea of actually modeling real-world entities with classes is so that you can model each independently. So in the singleton model, though, you only have one instance of a given class. So this probably isn't really appropriate for a student class, but you've actually been using a singleton pattern the past week or two in the context of CodeIgniter. Can you think of an example where there's apparently only one of something or of one class? Yeah. OK, so one course. Yeah, so quite possibly. So if you have a model called course, and you call CodeIgniter's load method so that you can then access the course object as this arrow course, absolutely. That's a case of the singleton pattern. And the one that comes for free, even if you haven't even implemented the notion of a course, is the database connection. So we used the database class in CodeIgniter last week. You've probably been using it or might be using it if you're using MySQL for your project. So when you say this arrow DB for database, that's a singleton object. And you configure that singleton object where? Well, not through parameters, but it's through like the database.php file. Recall you had to go in there once, or you or your partner had to add your username and your password and the like. So you configure that, and then CodeIgniter magically hands you one object. And so CodeIgniter is a big fan of this, for better or for worse, of passing you single instances of most classes. But CodeIgniter gets a little messy in that even if you have the notion of a course or a student or an instructor, CodeIgniter tends not to use a course object or a student object or an instructor object. It rather just hands you back from the database standard class object. So if unfamiliar, know that PHP has this very generic class called standard class. And this is the equivalent of Java's object class, if you took APCS or similar. So it's sort of a base class that is just a very generic way of putting stuff inside of some container. It's like a struct in C, but it can, in theory, also have methods associated with it. At least it can once you start defining one more precisely. So in short, singletons are when you have just one instance of a class. Why is this useful? It doesn't seem useful in the case of a student, necessarily. When would you want, or why would you want only one of something, perhaps? Let's use the database example. Why might it be compelling to only have a single database object that you access throughout your code? Yeah? OK, so you don't have to change your configuration options anytime. You create this object once, or in the case of CodeIgniter, it does it somewhere for you among its many files that have been written for you. They just configure it once and hand it to you. So that's compelling. Yeah? OK, so you don't have to trace problems that you might have back to multiple potential sources. You can go straight to the class or the object in question.
Does that have anything to do with just like the amount of queries you might make if you set up multiple instances of one object and like the data that can be tied up?
Yeah, so this is getting a little better and a little more compelling, I think, now technologically. The reality is that when you talk to a database, you might want to issue multiple selects, multiple inserts, multiple deletes. But what you probably don't need to do again and again is call MySQL connect or MySQL select DB. So think back to CS50 when we used those methods in particular, which were very much hard-coded for MySQL. Now CodeIgniter uses its own abstraction layer, so to speak, for database connection. So you can use Oracle or MySQL or something else. It genericizes the functions. But you probably, every time you issue a select in your Harvard Courses tool, you don't want to have to connect to the database, select the database, and then issue your select query, and then do this again and again, certainly not in some loop. So it's compelling to maybe have one instance of an object if that object is already doing something useful that only needs to be done up front. So in the case of the singleton model, you might connect to the database, select the specific database you want to use on that server, and then thereafter, you want all queries to be routed through that same object. You just don't need to have multiple connections. Now, conversely, what's a downside that derives from this same logic? What's bad about the singleton model? Yeah?
If you wanted to connect like, to more than one database.
Perfect. Yeah, right. Just as it's an advantage, it's also arguably a disadvantage if you actually want to talk to multiple databases. Now, in the apps you've done in 50 and are probably working on now, there's not necessarily a motivation to talk to multiple databases at once. But certainly as a project grows in size and has ever more classes and controllers and models, feels like it'd be compelling to be able to at least have the ability to connect to multiple databases. And the singleton pattern tends to get in the way of that. And also when it comes to testing, it can also introduce issues that we'll see perhaps over time when we move to that particular topic. So DAO, data access object. So this is kind of a fancy, unenlightening way of describing a very common model. And in fact, what CodeIgniter calls models are kind of reflective of this particular pattern. This model essentially prescribes that you have a class that, for now, this is an oversimplification, has a whole bunch of helper methods inside of it. So if you want to have a model in CodeIgniter called courses, well, inside of that courses class, you might have a method like get courses, get instructors, get day, get time, things that, or rather, get times, things that are related to courses as a whole. But let me wave my hand at this for a moment, and we'll come back to this in more detail with some actual code.